I grew up Martin Luther King. I was a child and watched all of that, watched the protests, watched the attacks on children in Birmingham. But there was a grounding for the movement. It wasn't all just about activism. It was a contemplative movement with activism. We started it in churches. You would pray and then you would go march, that kind of thing. We're not on the streets marching, but we are helping people face their internal truths. And once you can do that, then I think you're stronger to face all the other truths.
Welcome, everyone. Aminata Desert Rose Plant Walker, firewoman, here today with my special guest, Reverend Elizabeth Walker. She is the author of No One Left Behind, a beautiful book about grief, communal grieving, and healing together. I highly recommend this book. I had the pleasure, the surprise of meeting Reverend Liz at a women's gathering on Martha's Vineyard, where she was talking about her work with grief. And I felt such a strong connection with you, Reverend Liz. So thank you for being here today.
I felt the same connection, and I'm so honored to be here with you on your podcast. This is exciting for me. Thank you.
Tell us about, and also the graphic. It has this beautiful image on the cover. So tell us about No One Left Alone.
I love that graphic, that beautiful artwork on the cover that has a circle of people all connected, and no one is by themselves. Everyone is connected to someone else. In communities that where I've worked, where people live on the edge of poverty, the edge of marginalization, the edge of violence and addiction and issues that we have all over this country, there's a sense of isolation from all that's happening around you. And I would even argue in this country these days, there's a sense of isolation because there's so much going on. And so the idea was to say, this is a movement about remembering that we are all neighbors. And that's the idea of no one left alone, especially in grief, especially when we are going through stuff, which we are now.
My first question from the book was the idea that we belong to each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we forget that. Things distract us, things scare us, things silence us. And we forget that we are all connected. We are connected to the universe. We are connected to the grand scheme, to the big picture. And that's not even a religious statement. That's just a statement of reality. So I used to be a journalist. I was Boston's first Black woman on the weeknight news anchor desk. And I did that for 20 something years. And I was called from that into ministry. And when I went into ministry, the neighborhoods that I had covered as a reporter began to look a little different. And in going back into the community, Roxbury, one of the main neighborhoods that I had covered as a reporter. And as a reporter, I had covered it as another shooting in Roxbury, because that's pretty much how the media looked at this community. And I have to confess, I'm part of the media. That's how I looked at it. But going back in ministry and meeting people one-on-one and hearing people's stories led me to something else. So in looking at that neighborhood in a different way, through a different lens, I'm going to say the lens of love, the lens of connection, that it's not so much what's wrong with people, it's what's happened to people. And the people in our community have been through a lot. The young people who are responsible for the violence, the young people who are grieving the violence, all of us, mothers, fathers, preachers, everybody in the community is impacted by these kinds of incidents. So this is a neighborhood where there was a lot of gun violence, and one of our church members was killed. And that was the catalyst for us to get more involved in trying to figure out how we could support our community. Now, we are a social justice station, church, I'm thinking of TV, social justice church. We did all kinds of social justice work, but we were leaving out the emotion and the connection of grief. And you can't fight for social change if you haven't, I believe, if you're not also working on that internal kind of change. And so that's how this program started. And it was a program to allow people to come in once a month and talk about some of the things that had happened to them. and talk about the loss of their sons, including this young man in our church, Corey Johnson, who was 27 years old, had a lovely little family, and one night went out with a friend, and that was it. And there's so many stories like that. So ours was not to blame we weren't trying to get though his attackers were never found, which is also a story in our community. Ours was not to deal with that part of it as much as to deal with the collateral damage of that, because it impacts all of us. We couldn't bring Corey back, but we could try to focus on his family and his friends, his community, his school, all the different places where he had made an impact. And that's what started this program. So now we're in 20 different sites around the country, because other people are trying to figure out, how do we grieve? How do we release? How do we move through these horrible, trying times? And this is our answer to that you leave no one alone, that you listen to people, that you gather around people in pain, and you don't fix them, but you hold space, which is a word you've used here. You hold space for them. And that's a healing process.
For everybody.
For everybody.
Yeah. You said you're a social justice station. You corrected, you said you were a social justice church. And I think that's been maybe one of the things that's been missing in the movements for social justice, is attention to not just to shifting policy and wanting justice, as in we want different laws, we want different procedures, or we want a different district attorney. But what you're talking about, and no one left alone, is an internal kind of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say, Aminata, that during the civil rights movement, now we're in a different era, nobody wants to remember, but that's my era. I grew up, Martin Luther King. I was a child and watched all of that, watched the protests, watched the attacks on children in Birmingham. But there was a grounding for the movement. It wasn't all just about activism. It was a contemplative movement with activism. It was an activism with contemplation. We started it in churches. You would pray and then you would go march, that kind of thing. And I think that we have to make sure that we remember how important that was. So that's this notion of what we're doing. We're not on the streets marching, but we are helping people face their internal truths. And once you can do that, then I think you're stronger to face all the other truths.
Amen.
That we need to face.
So much so. I think one of the things I've noticed is wounded people, you know what they say, hurt people hurt people.
Absolutely.
And if we don't work through and find some softness, some healing, we'll just play out those hurts even inside our movements.
Absolutely.
Against each other.
Yep. It's just a cycle. And revenge begets revenge. And even those of us who think we're looking for peace, if we don't have peace on the inside, it's going to be more difficult. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Mm-hmm. I think that we have this program has changed my life internally, because I've had to face some of my own wounds. But it's once you start, it slows you down a little bit. You can't just, there's no quick fix here. You can't just open, you get a car and you get a car and you get a car. No, that don't work quite like that. It's a little slower, but it is lasting. I think it's lasting internal stuff. So anyway, that's what we're doing. And I get so excited when I talk about it, because I know that it works. It's not magic. It's not rocket science, but it's really taking your responsibility in community seriously. And it does work.
Yeah. And speaking of taking your responsibility in community seriously, it seems like our whole mental health system is very individualized. And what your book shows is that it's actually collective listening and speaking.
Absolutely. You know what? One of the things that was brought out to me, the woman who helped me co-found this, and this was co-founded by a group of us, so it's not anything that I came up with, but her name is Colleen Sharka, and she's a clinician, and she's the co-founder of this program. But her approach to healing and to mental health is, most trauma is public. There's police, there's fire department. You might have trauma in your house that nobody knows about, but most trauma is public. It's relational. It's a betrayal of a relationship. So it's never done in an isolation. Trauma is always between more than one person. And so healing has to happen that way. Judith Herman is a social worker, psychiatrist, researcher, wrote this book way back and was responsible for putting domestic violence in the realm of trauma, because that's a new thing. As a reporter, we couldn't even cover domestic violence pieces back in 1980s, 1970s. It was considered private as public when somebody's hurting somebody. And so a healing is best done in relational. It can't be done alone. You can't just go in your room and lock the door and heal with each other. So that's our premise. And that's a fact. That's a scientific fact.
Tell us the name of the program that you created.
Can We Talk? Very basic. Can We Talk is the idea that if I can begin to talk about what's happened to me, I can heal. If you will listen to what's happened to me, you can heal. And we listen to each other. It's a non-conversational, but it is sharing of our stories. So that's why I always say it's AA. We didn't base AA. That was not our model. But when we were working on it, we looked at this is AA. It's anonymous. It's based in most religious institutions, but not limited to that. So that in our church basement, for instance, we have this program. We started it in 2014 based on Corey's death. And we opened up the church once a month. And we had a little sign on the outside that said, if you're going through grief or pain or loss, if you've gone through trauma, come on in, let's talk about it. And we have a meal. We have some artistic expression. And then we open up the mic. We have guidelines that explain what the program is and open up the mic. And you would think nobody's going to get up with that. That doesn't sound like a lot. But we explain to people, this is your time to share. You can share anything. Don't advertise. We just give you some basic guidelines. Tell your story, not your cousin's story, that kind of thing. People get up and, oh my goodness, it's amazing. People say, I wasn't going to say anything. Or this happened to me a long time ago and I didn't tell anybody. We have a little time limit just because if you have a group of about 30 or 40 people, you want to give everybody the opportunity. And people get up for about 2 or 3 minutes and share a little bit and sit down. We have a clinician always on hand so that if the sharing gets, too much for any one person, then the clinician is there. But generally, because it's self-selecting and people understand we're going to talk about pain, most people are very open to it. They share their stories, they sit down. Now, what happens over time is that people come back and slowly a community is formed. We started the program once a month, but in Boston, in our neighborhood, people began to ask us if we could do it more. They liked the idea of having a safe space where they could trust the rest of the people. And that just happens. You don't have to fill out a form. We ask people, we'd like to keep this confidential. Please don't take anything you hear in here out. And we have never been betrayed, ever, over 11 years. And so more people wanted to come. So now we do it once a week in Boston. We do it because of COVID. We had to get off, everything changed with COVID. So we went from doing it in person to doing it online. So now we do it 4 weeks, once a week for each. And 1 week is online and 1 week is in person. So we go back and
So
forth.
you alternate.
We alternate, but we meet every week.
Every week there's a place, there's an opportunity. Yeah.
So it's probably about 25, 30 people show up either online or in person every week.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. And I love that you have guidelines to direct people so they know how to participate in the space and how to keep it available to everyone. And you have a clinician there in case something really overwhelming comes up for somebody, there's some professional support. That's really beautiful. One of the things I've been thinking about, Reverend Liz, is telling our story and the difference between telling our story or sharing our story and rehearsing our trauma.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And people always say, I don't want to come to something that all we're going to do is I'm going to tell you the worst thing that happened to me and you tell me. And that's not quite what it is. though I can see how you could look at it that way. Our story is bigger, obviously, than any one moment that happens to us. But when you go through a traumatic situation, when you witness a crime, or maybe you've had a crime on you that somebody has done to you, you've been abused, or if you've seen a hurricane or something just that shatters your sense of what's normal and what's real, it shakes up your mind of what's here and what's not here. And many people get stuck in that moment. So we are talking about real psychological trauma. This is not an issue of your coming in and telling me the worst thing that's ever happened to you. This is your opportunity to come on and to stand in front of a group of trusting, loving people and open up a part of you that you probably have shut down. So that's a little different. Because we are in a community where people have gone through all kinds of things, we have expanded that definition of trauma. So we have people who come in and talk about toxic stress. People come in and talk about bullying. So there is no limit on what it is. And some people come in and talk about very deep things, very painful, horrendous things, like the death of a son in a shooting. But what happens is, even whatever it is to you, if it impacted you in that way, we say that's traumatic. And by telling this story, you're not comparing your trauma against mine. What you're doing is just integrating what's happened to you and what may have you stuck in a way that you can move through it. And it is fascinating to me that the people who need it are the people who show up. So we have not had that experience where somebody feels like, oh my gosh, I can't tell my story because it's not as bad as hers or something. It usually works out just in the telling and in the atmosphere that's created.
That you create. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think a lot of, oh,
I was just going to say it's peer led too. And so it's not some hierarchy where I get up and I define what trauma is. It's the people are everybody who's a part of it has been through their own pain.
yeah, yeah. And can we talk?
And we talk.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is when you have a story and when a story has you,
That's it. That's the difference.
yeah, yeah. And what we're getting to is where we have the story,
Yeah.
where
You're
we're,
moving from the story has you to you own the story.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. That's exactly, and that's where a lot of people, particularly people, and I'm going to say this, and this may not be fair, but I know in the communities I've been raised in and the communities where I preach, there's a lot of silence. What goes on in this house stays in this house. What goes on in this family stays in this family. And that's a sense of protection and coping. But that can be really damaging. And so that's what we try to take on.
yeah. In your book, you do talk a lot about silence. You talk about healthy, rich silence, but you also talk about the silence that comes from fear. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that now.
You all right? I was raised in a home of silence. And part of that was just the times. I was raised in Arkansas in the 50s and 60s, and children were seen and not heard, and you didn't have confessional kind of celebrities. You didn't have Oprah. You didn't have, so there was no talk about that inner self or the struggles that you were going through. And I think that was just the times. No judgment on that. But what happens is that a lot of the struggles that we went through as people, my father, for instance, was an incredible preacher, never talked about his life, we didn't know anything about my daddy's life. And then he died, but he died with a lot of stuff unknown and unsaid. And my brother and I suffered from that, which I talk about in the book. So I speak from experience on how silence can be damaging when you don't know about some of the stories you need to know about your past. And I don't think my father was an abusive. I know my father was not abusive, and I don't think he did it to abuse us. I think he just never got to it, and then he died. But there's all kinds of reasons that we don't talk about some things in our families. And those things can be very damaging to us. The silence in my family was damaging to me, and it was damaging to my brother, who just passed about 18 months ago. And all that he suffered from physically had roots in his psychological and emotional struggles. So I talk about this in detail in the book, but I think that many families are like that. Many people are like that. Now, maybe not everybody, but there are enough that we should be concerned about it. This notion of silence. Communities stay silent out of fear. When this young man was killed in our neighborhood, the community wouldn't trust the police, so they never talked to the police. And they say, well, police don't like us, and and there's some truth in that. And the police said, we can't get witnesses. And there's truth in that. So our silence keeps us disconnected.
It's stuck. My mom used to say, our secrets keep us sick.
Absolutely. Your mom was absolutely on it.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you can have your story, and you mentioned one of the people who came up, a young man got up and spoke, you said at one of the sessions.
Uh-huh.
And he just said he had done some things that he wasn't proud of. He didn't go into any more specifics. And then he left. And I was thinking about when we have somewhere to go to say, I did this or I didn't do this, and can still be seen as human, and we still recognize you. You still belong to us.
Absolutely. And we have no judgment on that. That's not our role. Now, that may be somebody else's job, but it's not ours. And I think that young man, and he said just what you said, he didn't say much, but it was a real sign for me that this could work in the right situation. Now, I'll tell you a wonderful story. We just finished teaching a class here in Boston, which we're going to try to make available to our community for free every semester. It's not semester because we're not an institution, but we teach this class in the community through the church. And we had about 30 people who show up, and they come every week for 8 weeks. And one of those was one of the young men who was involved in this shooting, which is the core of my story, who had never, he'd just be beginning to heal. He's just beginning to heal 11 years after the shooting.
Yeah.
So I know that he talks about this now. And he's writing his story, which is really powerful because he was traumatized to the core. His brother was killed. He was shot, the bullet's still in him. And he had a lot of this just trying to get through it. And still, 11 years later, is trying to get through it. So that's what we are acknowledging, that it takes a lifetime sometimes to get through these situations. And we are going to try to be there. And if I'm not there, maybe my son will be there, or my daughter, or whoever will take this on, so that people have a space where they can go without judgment, without condemnation, just holding the space and being there in community.
One of the things that you say in the book is how untended grief builds up rather than wanes.
Absolutely. We think it goes away. We think one of our newest churches, newest communities is from Lewiston, Maine. And it was, I think maybe 2 years ago, you remember there was a shooting in Lewiston, Maine, a mass shooting where a guy went berserk and shot up the town. It's a very close-knit town, and it was devastating. And that's just one of many that happens in this country. And the minister of this church wanted to do something. There had been healing services and all these things that we tend to do. And she said that she would talk to people in the community. Her church is downtown in the area where the shooting was. And she said, people said, no, I don't want to talk about it. I want to move on. And that's our inclination, particularly in this country. I don't think we even ever grieved COVID in mass. Boston Marathon bombing here in Boston, we had that horrible situation back in 2013. And I'm not so sure we ever really grieved that, except for we had this mass service. But people go through these things and just try to move on. But if you don't take care of it, it will come back up in some way. Hurt people hurt people. That's what you said.
Yeah. If you don't take care of it in some way. And so I want to move to the wounded healer. A lot of people in the Mother Tree community are great servers and contributors to community, right? We're healing professions, teaching. But you have an interesting chapter on wounded healers and how the trauma that you are assisting people with actually reverberates inside of you. So I wonder if you could maybe read from your book about the Reverend
I'm going to read it right now. It's on page 77, chapter 5, Wounded Healers.
Okay, great.
And the line you said, but where do pastors take their wounds? Who ministers to them? Where do therapists and trauma counselors and emergency room nurses go for support? Most keep their pain to themselves until they run out of choices. Author Kirk Byron Jones, who's a pastor of a church, he's now retired from this church in Lynn and a good friend of mine, describes an early moment in his career when the enormous physical and emotional toil of his overloaded ministry almost crushed him. One evening, as he was midway through preaching a sermon at a church in another city, he realized in the middle of the sermon he couldn't go on. He turned to the pastor, a friend of his from seminary, and said he had to sit down. And this is his quote, "I had experienced the feeling before, but never to the extent that I needed to end a sermon in progress, and certainly never to the point of being forced to bow to that weariness so abruptly and so publicly." So I could go on with this story, but that's what I'm talking about. That's that burnout that ministers go through and police go through it and first responders, because we just keep going. And you have to take care of that secondary trauma, secondary grief. You take it all in. Nurses, doctors. There's so many stories of doctors, especially during COVID. I don't know if those stories have even been told about the doctors who committed suicide and the doctors who had heart attacks and the doctors who just went through horrible situations trying to cope with that. And then to be pretty much villains considered in the culture because everybody turned on the medical profession. Can you imagine? So this is a kind of a call to alert that we need to take better care of ourselves. We need to tend to our own wounds, and we need to tend to each other.
Yeah. We're going to take a break here. We'll be right back. We are back with our guest, Reverend Liz Walker, and her book, No One Left Alone. Reverend Liz, it is such a beautifully written book. You tell so many stories that just take us into the room with you when you are with your community having these grieving sessions. So I wonder if you could read from page 132 where you describe the sharing from one woman named Pat.
Absolutely. One night, Pat, a devoutly religious woman who usually offered original poetry at our gatherings, opened her little journal to read. But then she stopped, closed the book, and tearfully began to tell us about her son, Charlie. I've changed all the names just for your information. A bright child who had done well in school, Charlie had landed a job at a prestigious financial firm in New York. A few months after starting his new job, Pat said, Charlie began to show signs of depression. And before she and her family could figure out how to help him, Charlie suffered a breakdown and tried to kill himself. As she continued to share, Pat began to cry out, "Lord, my precious child, help me, Lord, help me." With tears streaming down her face, she swayed back and forth, praying aloud and sobbing. A member of our team quietly walked up and offered her tissues. I'm not sure how much time passed, but Pat's tears soon overtook her words, and her weeping grew into what I can only describe as wailing.
So when someone lets go like that, and in this situation, you supported her to just cry it out. Tell me, how do you transition? And is there some way between each person that you can create space? How do you do it?
This was the first time I had ever been exposed to this kind of situation. And I think social clinicians would say this is flooding, when you really just get to that point that you just let go. And there's a danger here because you want people to feel resolved, at least in that moment. You don't want to leave them like that. But Pat's situation, her wailing was so raw and so there, so in the moment, and because I wasn't sure what to do. After the woman brought her the tissues and she still continued, I went up and stood next to her. And I put my hand on her back and I just whispered if she wanted to go and pray, if she wanted to go somewhere else. And this was probably after maybe 7, 8 minutes. This was a long time. We let this go for a while. And I have to confess, I just didn't know how to handle it. And I kept thinking she would resolve. And she said yes. And that kind of broke it for her. And she and I went into the other part of the church and we did pray. But what we realized in that moment of her just releasing, that it was awkward. It was very awkward at first. But what we realized that people were crying with her. It flooded the whole room. And her vulnerability touched all of us. So that, now I'm a very religious woman, so I would say what started off as something out of control, in the end, I think was really helpful to all of us to enter in with her. When she and I went into the other room, I just sat with her and she cried a little bit longer, but not too much. That whole movement seemed to break her up. I didn't try to counsel her. I didn't say what's wrong or anything like that. And so what we try to do in our guidelines is explain that this is a space for these emotions. And we will be here. If you go a little longer, we will have someone in the back who raises their hands just to help you. If you need some extra care, our clinician is here. We have companions in the room who are trained. Now, they're not trained in psychology, but they are trained in recognizing trauma. They're trained in listening. They're trained in how to de-escalate to a certain extent. So we have all these kind of safeguards that are there. And again, in the guidelines, we say for 2 or 3 minutes. The room carries the rules. And people, yes, every once in a while, people will absolutely go way beyond the time. And we try to judge things on that moment. But it's generally such a safe space that because we have people in the room who are there to help you, that you can find some kind of a support in that very moment, if nothing else, to go with you and to sit quietly with you while you bring it together yourself. And I hope that, so that's how we're doing it so far.
I'm thinking about what you said about when you're flooded.
No.
Nothing can happen when you're flooded except to slowly find the ground with the support and take your time. Take your time.
And we meet you where you are. Now, we have educational nights that are separate from the Can We Talk, but they're for the Can We Talk community, where we teach about breathing, where we teach about movement, where we teach about all of those, I call them contemplative practices that we've always had, that has been passed down pre-Christianity from the motherland, of how we handle. I don't know if you've ever read Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, but he talks about trauma in the body and how we deal with that. So we have those practices that people in our community who come more than once will eventually learn. And that's the part that I find so hopeful. If you can learn how to regulate, how to control, you can teach somebody else. You can teach your child, teach your neighbor. Or so that's the kind of thing that we try to pass on, that education.
Yeah. And just what you said, we were talking about will hurt people. It's unconscious, it doesn't have to be intentional. But a regulated person who can catch their breath, which you also talk about in your book, can implicitly help a room, help someone else catch their breath.
Absolutely.
Find the ground.
Absolutely. When we started this, before we came on for the actual podcast, you helped me because I was all over the place, and we can help each other. And thank you. Help me just breathe. You're going to be all right. Maybe you're a little late. Maybe you didn't. But that's how we can help each other, especially now when everything's crazy every day in everybody's life.
When everything feels so tenuous. We're coming to the end of our time, Reverend Walker, but I want to give you a chance to talk about your own trauma. It seems what I really appreciate about your book was that you didn't just focus it on Corey's story or the larger Roxbury community, but you looked at yourself and you looked at your own grief and where you had gotten stuck. Tell us a little bit about your journey and where you are today.
Grief that I didn't even realize I was carrying. And I think that's the other thing I wanted people to know, because I have been a successful reporter. I've been a television news anchor. So my life from on the surface is I've done well. I haven't been stuck, but I have been stuck. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas during the 50s, during school desegregation. I am a child who watched Martin Luther King. That was impact, a major impact on my life. And when I was in the 7th grade, now Little Rock was desegregated, the Little Rock 9 Central High School, which is historically a moment in history that we all have read about and learned about. I was in the 1st grade when that happened. But when I was in the 7th grade, my class desegregated the 7th grade, junior high back then. And there were no cameras and there were no National Guard, but there were certainly fights and there was certainly hatred and bigotry and all that kind of thing in Little Rock. And my father had decided he wanted me to be a part of this. I didn't want to go because I had my little friends. I had my clique. I was rolling as a little kid. But my dad decided that I was going to take part in this larger thing going on in the community. But you didn't talk back to your father. If your father said you're going to do it, you did it. 2nd week of school, and it was awful. It was awful. Little Rock West Side Junior High School. There were probably maybe 50 Black kids out of 1,900 students, and they didn't want us there, and they let us know. Now, maybe some kids made it through fine. I did not. We were spit on. We were cursed at. It was all part of that period of life, and it was just rough. 2nd week of school, my father dropped dead. He had a stroke. And I was so devastated by his death, by being stuck in this school I didn't want. And I didn't, but back then, like I said, we didn't have psychiatrists that we knew of. There weren't therapy sessions. This was adversity and you just moved on. And nobody even talked to me about it. And the death of my father was a trauma for my brother and me and my mother, my stepmother. It was only after his death that my brother and I also realized that my stepmother was my stepmother. We didn't even know that before he died. So there was just all of this confusing, crazy stuff that exploded during that desegregation period and all got mixed up together in my head. And we never talked about it and life went on. It was only in going to these sessions, and this is the truth, listening to other people's stories that I began to, over the last 10 years, kind of start sorting through my own stuff, realizing that I had untended grief and trauma and have begun to see a counselor and have begun to work on my own pain. I say that not to victimize myself or anything like that, other than to say, there's some pain in there you don't even know. But I do know my behavior after my father's death. My brother and I both, we were rebellious. We were those kids. And by the grace of God, we made it through teenage years and into adulthood, but not without a lot of deep wounds. So it's clearing that up now. Is my whole thing when I preach about this is I want to heal before I die. I am in that season of my life, and I do not want to go to the grave with all of this untended pain. And my brother, unfortunately, did not get to heal fully, but at least we began to talk about it before he passed. So I know that this is important. So when I talk about this program, I'm talking about my heart. I'm talking about my own healing, which I'm still going through. And it's possible to heal. And that's why I think this program means so much to me, because it's nothing that I'm trying to sell. It's just trying to reveal in my story all our stories.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Reverend Walker. If people want to follow you, if they want to get the book, tell us, how can people stay in touch with you if they want to keep on the journey?
I'm on Facebook at Liz Walker and Pastor Liz on Instagram, but you can follow me, LizWalkerBooks.com, LizWalkerBooks.com, and you can follow our program is CanWeTalkNetwork.org. So it's pretty simple, CanWeTalkNetwork.org. We have 20 sites. We update you on what we're doing with those sites. Then I have a From the Heart, which is my streaming program. That's a podcast, not quite as elaborate and beautiful as yours, I must say, but we're just getting started. And I want you to come on and talk to us on our podcast. So we're growing and we want to keep in touch with you. And again, I thank you so much for giving me this space and this time.
Thank you. So we're going to close out our program today with Reverend Walker, the part of the book where she refers to Dr. King, letter from a Birmingham jail.
I first grasped the interconnection of all life through the words of Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Quote, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated," he wrote from the jail cell. "All of us," he wrote, "are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." We read that during the Martin Luther King holiday in January, but sometimes I think we stick it into just one definition. This covers everything, covers our pain, our joy, covers racial tension, covers the global problems in the world. He was a prophet, and this is huge in understanding why we all need each other and why we shouldn't leave each other alone.
So beautiful. Thank you, Reverend Walker. And if you want to get more of Reverend Walker, please read her book, No One Left Behind, a story of how community helps us heal. All right, until the next time, be gorgeous.